The other big talking point coming out of July 2002, before we get into talking show by show, is the fact that the company basically went broke. So they thought they were getting like 80,000 pay-per-view buys. The first show, they thought they did 80,000. They needed to do 50. That would have been a runaway success, making tons of money. Everything is fine. Like, but WWE were like leaking out to the world. It's like, there's not a hope they're getting 80,000. Like, not a solitary hope in hell that 80,000 people bought that show. Our sources are telling us it's closer to 18,000, which would have been dramatically below what they needed. And it turns out WWE were right. Because there was an employee for TNA named Jay Haspin, who was basically their pay-per-view relations and marketing guy. So he would talk to In Demand, he would talk to all the pay-per-view companies and ensure that, you know, everything's running smoothly, they'd get all the promotional material, that all the deals were made, that, you know, TNA aired on the right night with the right content, and it went like, all that went smoothly. That was his job. Turns out, he wasn't doing it.
Damn it, Hassman.
And he was being paid six figures as well. This guy is being paid a six-figure salary, just like Vince Russo, and he utterly calamitously did not do his job. It turned out all of his pay-per-view estimates were utterly made up. He would fraudulate? Fraudulate's not a word. Is fraudulate a word, Liam?
Fraudulent's a word. I don't know if fraudulate's a word.
But he would manufacture documents from In Demand. He would print stuff out on their letterhead, telling how many pay-per-view
This
buys
seems
they got.
super illegal.
It is. It's just full-on fraud. Because by all accounts, he was basically working for WWE as well at the time, so it was an utter conflict of interest.
How does this happen?
He was working for a marketing company that also worked for WWE. So there's people that believe that either A, it was like flat out sabotage on behalf of a guy who was also working for WWE, or like less maliciously, that it's a guy who just knew he had a marketing gig with WWE, so did not care enough about trying with TNA, even though they were paying him six figures.
Someone clearly didn't do their due diligence ahead of time.
But like, he was working for the company since February. Like, he was one of like the early employees. It was Team Sports, by the way, was the name of the company he was working for, that was also working with WWE. So he was that was a full-on conflict of interest. He was forging documents that suggested they were doing better pay-per-view numbers than they did. Because at one stage, one of the In Demand people showed up to one of their shows and it's like, oh, hey, you know, we got these numbers from Jay, they're saying we got 80,000. It's like, we haven't talked to Jay in months. Jay's disappeared. He doesn't interact with us. And then they were like, wow, what?
That is definitely a red flag.
Yeah, when the dude who's meant to be like your pay-per-view provider relations is not in fact talking to the pay-per-view providers, that's usually a thing that makes you think, oh geez.
Damn, Jay's at it again.
Yeah, Jay said there's like, oh, we're on Dish Network, we're on Cablevision, everything's fine, and it turns out they weren't. So they didn't have the pay-per-view clearance they thought they had. They had all these press kits that were meant to go out that weren't sent out because he didn't do it. Like, he didn't do anything he was being paid to do.
I hope they, like, sued this dude.
We'll get into we'll talk about this more next month as well, because they file a lawsuit in August. So we'll talk about the lawsuit against Jay Hassman next month. But we're simply talking about the incompetence of Jay Hassman on this episode.
Jesus.
So from Jerry Jarrett's book, by Hassman's numbers, we thought we had about 175,000 buys for the first three shows. Instead, In Demand is projecting us at about 50,000 buys for the three shows combined. So basically, the company went broke. They realized they were burning through cash at a rate they could not sustain, so they dramatically slashed costs. Because this company started as like, we're going to tour city to city, we're going to bring the show on the road, we're going to try and get like 3,000-4,000 people in these buildings every week. Nope. Then they're like, all right, we're going to do a residency in Nashville. We're going to go to the Municipal Auditorium in Nashville, which was going to be called the TNA Dome.
The Total Nonstop Action Dome.
Yep, the TNA Dome. So we're going to go there. It's a big building. We'll get people in every week. We can have like this big scale. We'll look like a big major league presentation. And then it turned out, after the Jay Hassman scandal, they were like, all right, we have no money. We cannot afford these big buildings. We cannot afford these bigger crews. We have to slash costs. We have to like dramatically scale back on everything. We have to cut the number of people we're booking. We have to do a lot to save money because we're going to go broke. And they cut it back. Jerry Jarrett says he wants to scale operations back to under 30,000 per show, considering that it was at one stage projected to be about $250,000 per show. That's a pretty dramatic cut down in costs.
It's just funny that this could even occur. But it's also somewhat impressive that they managed to like make it through this.
Well, they didn't. But
There we go.
They did basically go broke and they were bailed out by Panda. And if they weren't bought by Panda, the company would have closed in September. But we'll get into that when we get to September. But I suppose they did survive. Someone did buy the company. They did find new financing and they did soldier on. But yeah, this was a point at which they were like, oh, geez, everything is going to shit. This is a disaster.
Vince McMahon cackling in his throne.
Because he called Jerry during this period trying to work out what was happening. And maybe he's just like, I'm going to rub it in because I'm sabotaging your company.
Listen, pal.
The week after TNA launched, Vince did his famous ruthless aggression promo. And they actually speculated, like Jerry in his book was sending copies of that promo to lawyers, being like, he's actively saying on television he's trying to put us out of business. He is using his monopoly power to take us down.
Should have sued Vince. That would have bankrolled the company at least till September.
So yeah, the company moved from the municipal auditorium, the bigger building, to the Nashville Fairgrounds, which would be dubbed the Asylum, become the long-term home of the company for 2 years. It's not quite dubbed the Asylum yet. It'll be dubbed the Asylum in August.
Sure looks like an asylum.
That's the thing. The building, especially for the first week, because it's pay-per-view number 5 that they're there first. The one with Red. No, is it 6? It's the one with Red and Loki. Yeah, it's 6. That's the show that they're in the Asylum first. And it looks like a terrible building. It's like dark. You can clearly see the costs were cut. Like Don West's pay was cut in half.
Yeah, he couldn't afford those shirts anymore.
Yeah, the audio quality is worse, the visual quality is worse, the stage is worse. You can actively just, because their first week in the fairgrounds, it just looks terrible. It looks grim. It feels like a company that's about to go out of business. And by all accounts, they spent the week like painting the place and trying to do it up and make it a little more respectable on pay-per-view by the time they got to number 7.
Buy the building, or were they just like, hey, we need to renovate this building, please let us renovate this building?
They were like, please let us renovate this building. I'm sure they were like, the owners of the building were like, wait, you want to do up our building and we're not going to pay for it? Yeah, sure. If you want to paint the building, sure.
They probably should have just like bought the building at that point.
That would have been too expensive. Maybe you would have saved on rent over time. Who knows? The building probably wasn't expensive to rent anyway.
It looks like an independent.
It does go from like the first, whatever it is, 5 shows look like the real major league. It's a little dated in terms of how it looks. It looks more like late 90s than 2000s. If you compare it to like Raw at the time, it doesn't look like modern and cutting edge. But at least in terms of like the size of the building and the scale of it, it looks like major league. It looks legit. As opposed to when you get to the Asylum, it does look all a little bit grim and a little bit small. And even the crowds are just kind of dead. Like the enthusiasm is kind of sapped out in the Asylum for the first couple of weeks. And it just feels like a company that's going nowhere at the time.
It looks like it wouldn't have been completely out of the realm of possibility for like Ring of Honor or CZW to run this exact building.
Mm-hmm. It probably would have looked like the lighting is probably above like Ring of Honor level, but just the visual aesthetic, not so much. So yeah, Jay Hassman screwed the company over. And I think the worst thing that happened, if you read an interview with the PW Torch, where Jerry Jarrett, it might be denial, it might be like delusion, but they kind of see this as a moment of false hope, where it's like, we were doing none of the marketing and promotions and we had none of the clearances we thought we had. And that's the reason that we have the bad pay-per-view numbers. Like, they kind of like, they think there's a little bit like, oh, you know, if we can get our marketing up to scratch, if we can get our pay-per-view clearance up to scratch, we'll actually be able to do like a kind of reboot. We'll be able to reintroduce ourselves to audiences, and we'll maybe be able to hit the number of like buys we need to break even. So there's like this false hope that if they can get these things in order, that everything will be fine. And I think if you watch these shows, if you see the decline in attendance from the Huntsville shows to the Nashville shows to the Asylum shows, you can see that it's a company that's not hot whatsoever. It's a company that just did not find an audience at the beginning. And they maybe have some false hope that if they can get these things in order, they might find that audience.
Do you think if they had have had all their ducks in a row ahead of that first episode, they would have come up with like a much stronger start, and that would have sustained them to a longer extent?
But they would have probably made more money. Like, that first show probably would have been more successful. They would have been better marketed. More people would have bought it. But then I asked myself the question, would the people who then bought that first pay-per-view continue to buy the pay-per-views based on what they saw? And my answer would still probably be no.
I was also thinking, as I was watching these shows, do you think a more modern subscription-based payment schedule would have helped?
Oh, 100%. If this company launched in 2015 and was just on streaming with $9.99 a month, it would have been a much like better financial investment, or for fans at least. You know, it's $10 a month for 4 shows, and we can subscribe, and that's what sustains a ton of indies these days. That model, that's what sustains WWE.
How much were these pay-per-views at the time?
$9.99.
So that's the saying. Like, if this had have launched 2002, $10 a month, you get 4 shows.
Well, in 2002, the technology wasn't there to do that, but yes.
I suppose there's no way to actually initiate reoccurring payments, is there?
Well, I'm interested. Like, I don't think they ever did like a season pass, or maybe they did. Maybe they did like, I think they did do some like bulk buys. You can get some for cheaper or some stuff like that.
Yeah, so that's what like seems like the natural progression of this to me, is like if we're not getting the buys that we want weekly, we might be able to increase that by offering us a price point.
Well, what they did start doing was they started looking into trying to get some kind of syndicated television show as promotion. They did end up finding it. It's what turned into Explosion. But they started looking for more of a marketing vehicle for it, as opposed to trying to cut the price of the shows or do like mass discounts or something like that. Like, I'm not sure what the pay-per-view technology was at the time, that you could probably bulk buy a number of shows at once, but it's probably not sophisticated enough that you could be like, all right, you can pay $9.99 per show, or you can give us 100 a year and you'll get all our shows. You'll get 52 shows for the price of 10, basically.
I think a lot of people get their money in these like sort of month-by-month systems by people who forget, and they just have reoccurring payments.
That's basically the backbone of all of streaming, yes.
Yeah, so it's like, even if it was a $10 price point for 4 shows a month, you'd still have to have a way of people like actually getting onto their services and purchasing that $10 price point each month, which is just not going to happen to the same sort of extent a reoccurring cycle would.
I'm still paying for Crunchyroll from watching Naruto.
That's what I'm saying. We're bringing it back.
We're freaking paying for Crunchyroll for a year, and we haven't watched a single episode of Naruto, Liam.
Soon to the Patreon.
The Naruto watch along.
Yes.
We'll talk about more about Jay Hassman, I'd imagine, considerably going into the future, especially because the lawsuit is filed the next month. So they start suing each other and they start going to court. Jay Hassman tanked TNA.
The first major heel.
The reason it could work is because like pay-per-view numbers are famously slow to come in. You know, like when someone buys a pay-per-view, by the time the company know exactly how many people have bought it, and by the time like people's credit cards have cleared and the money's been collected and the money's delivered, it's like 3 months down the line before anybody gets money out of the pay-per-view company from the pay-per-view they bought, which is actually that's what contributed to the death of ECW, where ECW had cash flow problems because they couldn't get their pay-per-view money fast enough, and they spent all their money, and when they busted them, went out of business, and WWE bought them. So the reason he could kind of get away with it is because there's not that instant feedback that there would be if it was like a digital online payment. You know, when you buy a pay-per-view through a digital service like a Fight know exactly how many they sold immediately, because they see in real time, you bought it, you paid for it, this is how many we sold. As opposed to here, it's like 3 months down the line before they have like firm figures about how many people bought these shows. So Hassman could kind of give them like, you know, these are our estimates, these are our early like projections, and he could spoof and get away with it. And that's why it took the best part of a month to find out he was making shit up, because this information does come in slowly. So his fraud at least was built on, you know, firm foundations that he could get away with it for a while.
It was built on a flawed system.
Yeah, he exploited the system.
That's how most, white collar crime happens, though, isn't it?
Yeah, and you could argue they probably should have like worked it out earlier, and maybe but like, you know, you have a guy who you're employing who's telling you that,
yeah, you're paying a guy 6 figures a year, you expect him to kind of deliver on his job.
And by all accounts, he was faking emails and he was faking all kinds of stuff from In Demand. So like, he was going to lengths to do this.
Yeah, it wasn't just like, I'm just gonna like pretend this thing's happening when it isn't. Like, he was actively trying to deceive the company.
Yeah, it's like forwarding emails that tell them about the buy rate, and then In Demand were like, we never sent that email. That's not from us. So what can you do at that stage, you know?
This is all allegedly.
Yes,
illegal.
Well, we'll talk about what was decided in court over time.
Yes, but that's next episode. So for this point, it is alleged and allegedly, and we are all making jokes, and none of this is real.
I don't think Jay Hassman cares about TNA anymore. How much do you think Jay Hassman thinks about TNA? What's Jay Hassman up to?
I think maybe he needs to recoup those losses and come after our big Patreon bucks.
Oh no, we just bragged about all the people who signed up. He knows we've got the money.
I know, I just bought my groceries.
Yeah, you have to go to patreon.com/kiddingme to finance our legal fund against Jay Hassman.
Hasman versus Garrett and Jones. Coming soon.
I like the way you use my first name and your last name.
Kidney and Jones.
I'm like Enya. I just go by Garrett.
J and K.